this away.
In this episode, we talk about drugs and addiction. If you or anyone you know is struggling with addiction, please call the Alcohol Drug Information Service on 1-800-250-015 or Narcotics Anonymous Australia on 1300-652-820. Both these hotlines provide confidential support 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Well, this is Why Do I Feel This Way with Kate DeAraugo. I'm Claudia Coy, the random voice you're hearing, a good friend of Kate's.
I don't think you're that random anymore. I don't think your voice is that
listening
random.
And they're like, wow, that's a beautiful dulcet tone there. And then who's that? So, you invited me to share your story with you.
Yes.
And kind of be part of this journey, which is such an honor. It has been really cool being part of this with you. And again, I'm super excited to get into this chapter and to learn more. So where we left off last episode, I don't know if you used the word rock bottom, if that's part of your language, but I'll let you talk about the end of last episode.
Yeah, look, we were certainly, I'd got to that point where emotionally, spiritually, and my internal world was done. I was tapped out, you know what I mean? And I, from previous, stories in the episodes, like there was plenty of other moments in my life where it would have seemed like that would have been enough, like, publicly getting caught using or getting stabbed with a machete or getting caught by the police with weapons and all of that stuff that people would go, surely that's enough for her to stop, or losing careers or hurting, all of that stuff. But it wasn't, and I think, it's not about the external stuff, because by that point for me, the external stuff didn't matter anymore. I was on this journey to escape and run from myself, and I was prepared to do whatever that took. But the moment when I looked and saw past the external and saw inside my own soul, and that I was essentially dead inside, sounds dramatic, but it was how I felt. And yeah, I had this knowing in that moment, like it was just a small window of opportunity where I saw everything for exactly what it was, and I knew that if I didn't change, what was next wasn't going to be good,
Had you had any moments like that before in your journey?
No.
That was the first time?
No. Never had I been frightened like that. And to be honest, I've heard a lot of people in addiction and now in recovery talk about that moment where they didn't want to live. Like I didn't want to live, and I living seemed too hard, but dying, I didn't know how to die either. And it's a really weird space to be in, and I don't know if unless you've been in that particular position, you can really understand that. But yeah, in that moment, I didn't want to be anywhere, but I did. I knew that if I didn't make a change now, I was never going to. This was 100% going to be my life until the end. Yeah.
And you made a phone call.
Yeah. So I spoke to my mum, and my mum was the last one. I mean, my family never let me my family never stopped loving me, but they were done with my behaviours, and they were done with the bullshit and the lies, and they just didn't believe anything that came out of my mouth, which was totally fair. But my mum was still there for me, and she came and she got me, and I said, I want to go, I need help, and I'm ready to do the work. And I'd been to rehab. This wasn't my first rodeo. I'd been to rehab many times over the years, but my mum came and got me, and she took me to Melbourne to a rehab that I'd been to earlier. About 4 years before that, I'd done another, rally to get better. But I to be honest, I went to rehab because my partner at the time went to jail, and I was just trying to be a good girlfriend, really, all the wrong reasons. And when he came out, I went to see him, and we went straight back to what we were doing. You know what I mean? I wasn't ready, and I'd just taken that next step in my using, and I wasn't done with it yet. You know what I mean? It wasn't painful enough yet for me to stop.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I went back to this rehab that I'd been to a few years earlier. That wasn't necessarily there's different types of rehab. They're different. They serve different purposes, and they focus on different things. And this particular rehab that I went back to start with was it's called Sober Living Rehab. And in the end, they would be probably the ones that changed and saved my life on a really big scale. But I went back there initially for help, but I hadn't put together the pieces that I or I couldn't get my, I just couldn't stop using. Like I wasn't locked down. There was enough wiggle room for me to lie, steal, cheat, and continue all those behaviors. You know what I mean? I didn't have it in me on my own without some pretty serious help to actually put down the drugs. That obsession and compulsion and that animal addiction side of me was just too big and too loud and too powerful by that point. And the fear, as I've sort of talked about, that fear of actually stopping and putting it all down and looking at myself and sitting with myself and all of that pain and shame and hatred and resentment and fear that I'd collected over the past 32 years by now was just so terrifying. I knew it had to be done, but I just didn't know how to get to it, if that makes sense. So, yeah, look, I was in that rehab for about 3 weeks and they did everything they could for me to try and just regulate me or help myself regulate, with some different medications and what have not, to just slow me down and stabilize me a little bit. But I was just, my insanity was, I was just crazy. And look, they didn't know that I had drugs and I was still using in the bathroom and sneaking out at night and scoring and being wild. So, I want to chat about that too, because for people who haven't experienced rehab before or don't know a lot about it, so what does it look like? So your mum drops you off at this sober living. Yeah. What does that look like when you step in? Yeah. So look, as I said, each there's lots of different rehabs and they all serve lots of different purposes. And the one that I'm talking about now specifically it's more of a transition space that is more helpful to help you. Like by the time I got there, like I didn't know how to live, you know what I mean? I didn't know how to do basic life stuff anymore. I didn't know how to get out of bed without using a drug. And it's really about reintroducing, it was about reintroducing me back or clients back into a world and teaching them how to do it sober and doing it gently. So it was somewhere where you could, you would do your group processes in the morning and group therapies and check-ins and talk about some deep stuff and unpack traumas and what have not. But then in the afternoon, there would be the space to go out and do, go to a bit of shopping or go and do an NA meeting or go and see friends and do normal life stuff and then come back in and unpack it and see how you went for the day. And there was extra supportive therapy and therapists and support workers, but there was too much freedom for me at that particular time. I wasn't capable of making good life choices on my own. The way I treated my family during that time was just on another level. Like my ability to care was gone. I ended up in a psych ward at the Alfred one night and I checked myself out in the morning and I had people that loved me standing there begging me, like with tears in their eyes, saying, "Kate, please don't go." And I just looked at them and I said, I can't, I'm sorry. And I went and used, and that was the last time I saw them before I used for the last time, if that makes sense. Yeah. And can we talk about the last time? So basically, I guess that was that moment, that last part, like through my whole using, and again, I'm not blaming, there's no blame, and my family have been unbelievable, and the way they have done their own healing and their own recovery, as I've done my recovery, has been nothing short of amazing and very brave of them. They didn't have to, but they went out and got their own help. But they enabled me a lot, and they would rescue me. They were forever rescuing me from where I was, rescuing me from a debt or rescuing me from homelessness or making sure that I had what I needed. So there was always a part of me that was, I guess, subconsciously that was like, well, I know that I'll be a safety net there. I'll be all right. Which sounds like when you're saying like they rescue me from debt, they rescue me from homeless, like that actually sounds like a loving family. It sounds like something a normal family would do. Yeah, of course. For someone who was in trouble, right? Of course. That's the natural thing to do to somebody you love, right? You want to rescue them and save them. But for me at that point, I always knew that I'd be all right and I could probably maybe like dust myself off and get back up and keep moving, or they'd always be there, But in this last time, and that last time I walked out and said, no, sorry, I choose drugs. My mum spoke to me and she said, okay, well, I love you and you're my daughter. Oh, wow. I love you and you're my daughter, but I've actually got 2 other beautiful children that I need to go and love and that need me. And there's a bed for you at a rehab, which was more of a lockdown hospital. It's called, Melbourne Private Hospital in Melbourne. And she said, there's a bed for you there if you get there on Monday, if you make it there, and complete the program, we'll talk, essentially. And through whatever, I don't know what, I wish I could put it in a bottle and sell it. Well, not sell it, give it to people. I wish I could bottle that feeling in that moment, and that moment of clarity and that gift of desperation, which you'll hear me talk about a bit. I made it. I got there that day, and I got to that rehab on my own, and I stood out the front of there, and I didn't have any cigarettes. And I was like, I'll call Mum. She'll give me $50 for a pack of darts. And I called her. I said, Mum, I'm at the rehab. I need cigarettes. And she said, bad luck, mate. And she'd never done that to me before. She'd never just gone, no, you're on your own. And I walked into this rehab, and the nurses were there waiting for me with the paperwork, and I'd never done that initial part on my own. I'd always had my mum holding my hand, telling me it was going to be okay, making sure I went in with clean clothes and fresh undies and a pack of cigarettes or a carton of cigarettes or whatever it was I needed. And I walked in there with nothing. You know what I mean? I didn't even, I think I had a little tiny overnight bag with some bullshit clothes that I'd had on, and I thought I was owning life because I was in a pair of heels and a fucking fake Louis Vuitton scarf. And I walked in there and it all hit me. And I had, I guess there's this waiting room, and it's all, very lovely, and there's all these prayers on the wall and all these inspirational things and what have not. And it wasn't the first time I'd been there. And filling out this paperwork, it just hit me, and I cried. Like I just was so terrified. And yeah, I had, which, is pretty common. I had that last bit of, was going to be that beautiful moment where I divorced and separated from drugs. And I had my last bit of ice with me that I was going to use, and I went into the bathroom in the foyer, and I sat there, and I'd made sure it was quite a bit, so I was going to have this massive last hurrah, and it was going to be beautiful and whatever it was, and I used it, and it fucking didn't work, you know what I mean? And it did nothing, and I just sat in this bathroom floor lost and terrified, and it's like it's just like everything, the world stopped for that moment, and I knew that this was it, and I was about to walk through these double locked doors, and have to go into the biggest battle of my life.
How's that timing too? Like literally in the foyer of the rehab, and it's the first time we that didn't. Yeah. Can I ask the fashion choice of the heels?
I found these two. This couple, and they were just pretty flamboyant guys, and you know what, they did their best. They actually dropped me off at rehab, and they did their best to just make me feel. They fed me like salmon and green vegetables, and we were using drugs and what have not. And he gave me this scarf, and I'd put on a face, and but which all sounds fun and games, and it was, but I guess it also just reflects on how insane I was at the time. Like my whole life had burnt literally to the actual ground. There was nothing left, nothing. And I'm eating, and my family is sitting at home, hearts breaking, thinking they're never going to see me again, and I'm out and I'm going to die. And I'm sitting in some penthouse in, St Kilda eating green vegetables and salmon and wearing heels and laughing.
Yeah.
Like that's how unwell and deluded I was by that point.
Because there's something, obviously, when I think of rehab, it's not super glamorous, but then and like knowing what was ahead of you, and then you're walking with heels.
There's nothing glamorous about the way I did that.
You know what I mean?
It was actually just sad.
An interesting choice.
Tragic. Yeah. It was more a like how I thought I looked and how I actually looked were two very different things. Yeah, I was insane, and I still wanted to have this front of like I'm okay. Like, despite all of the shit that I wore and the fact that I, again, was standing there in this pair of heels with this Louis Vuitton and this overnight bag with basically nothing in it. And I don't think I had a pair of clean jocks, you know what I mean? Like, I was crazy. Yeah, but I guess it's all wrapped up in my ego and this thing of still trying to pretend that there was some part of me that was okay.
Yeah. Because you looked all right.
Because I thought I looked all right.
Yeah.
I'm sure if we had a snap of that moment, I'd like to get my intake photo from the...
Is there an intake
There
photo?
is. There'd be records of that. I should find it. I'm sure they would give it to me, but there's an intake photo of what I actually looked like on that day. Yeah.
So you walk in the doors, the double doors.
Yeah.
They, I imagine, security check everything.
Yeah, so that's a whole different experience. So bags, not that I had a lot at that point. Bags are checked, everything's checked, pockets are checked. Nurses, you know, do that intake. And then there's also the safety side of, like, most people go into rehab and they've done exactly what I've done. Like, they've gone as hard as they can because they think it's the last time they're ever going to see their drug, or hope that it's going to be the last time they're ever going to see their drug or their drink or whatever it is that they're trying to detox from. So there's a level of danger in that.
So that's quite common for people to have their last hit before going
absolutely. Like, there's very rarely do you see someone turn up to that kind of rehab straight. You know what I mean? Like, there's been times in previous admissions that I openly said, like, just get me enough drugs to get me to the door, because if I get straight, I'm gone. You know what I mean? And that was the only way I was getting to rehab. You know, was to just get me enough gear to get me there. Which sounds counterintuitive, right? But it's just that, as I said, like, that total inability to sit with yourself and to have ownership and to look at the train wreck that was behind me.
It almost sounds like it was too big of a reality to take on sober. Like, you almost needed to be high on drugs in order to put yourself into rehab.
Absolutely. For me, and like, I can't talk for anyone else, but for me, I think if I had have been clear enough, I wouldn't have got there. Yeah. If that makes sense.
That does make sense.
Like, if I had have had a clear mind in that moment, I don't know if I would have been able to walk through the door.
Because the gravity of what you're about to do would have been
too great.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I needed to be that little bit numb and not present in that moment. Yeah.
Can you talk me through how you're feeling walking in after you've been checked? Like, you're really walking in now and this is your new reality for 6 weeks.
Look, it's foggy. That first bit's pretty foggy. I just remember the terror, like the pure terror, but I still remember my internal world did not match my external world. So in my internal world, I literally could barely breathe, and it was just so overwhelmed it's almost shut down, if that makes sense. But I'm still trying to have a joke and be jovial and make it lighthearted with these nurses. And, you know, rehab's are quite a small community. You know, it's more often than not, if you've been before, you'll go in and you see somebody that you know, which is sad. You know, relapse is unfortunately a big part of a lot of addicts' story, and that's super normal too. Like, you know, it's just because if you don't get it the first time or even the second time, or in my case the 8th time, it doesn't mean that you can't get it. But yeah, my attitude on the outside didn't match the inside.
You've spoken about how this was your 8th time in rehab, but this was the one that stuck.
Yeah.
You know, did it feel different that day? Was there something in you that was like, oh, this is going to be the one now that changes things?
I guess part of it was because I knew that what was waiting for me on the outside looked really different too. You know what I mean? There was no 50-second chance, you know, or there was no cushy landing for me out there anymore. You know, if I walked out of that door, and I guess that's what I needed. Like, if I walked out of that door before I completed that program, I was homeless.
You know, as we said, there'll be listeners here who might have no experience with someone with addiction, and there might be listeners who have family members, friends, or even personal experience.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really valid point, what you said about how we can help as the loved ones.
Yeah.
Is educating ourselves.
And look, and also, like, I'm really aware that I'm super lucky. I'm super lucky that I had a family that loved me and that were there for me. And I think if I didn't have their support, even though their support in the end was really harsh, and it was, it was hard support. I don't know what it would have looked like. I can't answer that question. And I do want to, I think the sense of community and all of that stuff was a really big part, and whatever that looks like for any individual might be different. Like as I said, I appreciate that not everybody has a family like mine, but finding your people that can love you unconditionally through that time is something that we'll talk about a bit further down the road. But like rehab, I knew it was different that time because I knew that life on the outside was going to be different. And I also knew that I didn't have any more. It's a funny thing. I'll always have more using in me now. Like I know that if I picked up a drug tomorrow, I'd be off and running. I'll always have more using in me. I'm programmed. There's a part of me that's programmed to do that. However, I know, and I knew in that moment, that I did not have another day one. I did not have another stop. I didn't have it in me to, I didn't know if I'd ever get that window of opportunity where I had enough sanity in me to know things had to change.
Yeah. Let's get into it then. So you're in the door. You've been checked. You showed your room, I imagine.
Yep.
Can you talk about that 6 weeks kind of that followed in that rehab? Yeah,
so like the hospital, it is a hospital. Like it's a hospital bed. You don't get a big double bed with, your pillows turned down at nighttime and towels at the end of the bed. It's a hospital, and it's set up for safety and all of that stuff. And you normally have to share a room with somebody else. But obviously, once you get in there, the drugs are going to start to wear off and the detox begins. And that's the first hurdle, and there's lots of hurdles in recovery, and stopping drugs is just the first part. You know what I mean? Putting down the drugs and getting through that detox is the first challenge. And it's horrendous, and it's different for everybody. And obviously the detox all depends on what drug you've been using, and how long you've been using it for. I think my chemist is surprised that the most dangerous drug to detox off is actually alcohol.
Is that right?
Yeah, alcohol causes the most damage in the body. And please don't paraphrase me like this. I'm not a medical person, but I know that most medical emergencies happen in detox from alcohol withdrawal.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's it's not. They don't just lock you in a room like you see on a movie and you sweat yourself stupid and all of that. It's gently done, and there's some medication that takes the edge off it. But the rubber hits the road pretty quickly. And they're monitoring you. I guess at that point the staff would know what to expect. Absolutely, they've seen it, and they've seen it all before. You know what I mean? And so every however long it is, I can't remember. It might start off every hour and then go to every couple of hours. Like they check your obs, they check your heart rate, they check your your pulse, check your sweats and all the different things that can happen. And I'm not going to lie, it's fucking horrible. And so when I detoxed from ice, and on the very rare occasion that I would run out of drugs or allow myself to have to come down through my using, what happened to me, and I think it's quite common in ice withdrawal, is I rage. Like a beast wakes up inside of me that is just fury. And I think it's just fear and anxiety and all of that stuff. It's just a byproduct of that fear that drives me, or that drove me in that moment. But and basically, I just want to rip my own skin off. You know what I mean? I just want to break things. I want to hurt things. I want to hurt people. I want to hurt you. I want to hurt me. I get really nasty. And I just become a person that I certainly can't imagine being today anyway.
So that happens. How long does that last?
I want to say the physical withdrawals are about a week.
A week? I
think for me. I got in that bed at rehab, and I got in there and I got under those blankets, and I basically said to the nurses, just fucking get out. And I was not a nice person. Like, just stay the fuck away from me, because if I get out of this bed, I'm going to use. And there was the added part of me that wasn't just detoxing from drugs. As I mentioned to you in the previous episode, I was also going through very intense love addiction, and having to detox from love addiction is just as, if you've ever experienced it, you'll understand, if not more painful than detoxing from drugs. And I was doing both at the same time.
And you mentioned that this particular rehab hospital, you actually couldn't leave to get your fix.
No. Like there was no. I mean, you could, but if you walked out the door, you weren't coming back in.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It was a discharge. You had to do paperwork. You took your bags and you left. There was no popping back in the afternoon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you were forced to just kind of sit with it for a week.
That
Not just a week. I shouldn't say that, but that detox, that really intense detox period.
Yeah, that intense detox. You just do it. And I guess there's, in some ways, even though that sounds like the hard part, it's kind of the easier part because you sleep a lot, or I slept a lot, and so a lot of it can be you sort of asleep and still in that avoidance, still able to avoid what you're trying to, or what's sitting there to be looked at by sleep.
Did you have your phone with you?
No phone. So you get stripped of everything, anything that you could possibly imagine that you can
distract yourself.
Distract with, gone. Yeah. No telly, no TV, no music, no phones, no caffeine.
I imagine that's a scary place for someone who's been avoiding themselves for 12 years.
It's hell on earth, essentially. You know what I mean? Like, and I think that's the only way to really, if you really want to look at, and as I've said to you, by this point, it's been so many years and I've been running and hiding and avoiding for so long. I don't even really fucking know what I'm running and hiding and avoiding from in the first place. Like, I know I've done a lot of damage and I've hurt a lot of people and I've, done a lot of behaviors that I'm not proud of, and I've, done all of that stuff in my using, but like, I don't even know what the core of the issue is anymore. So I think the only way to really get to the core of it is to be forced to sit and go in.
The intensity of detoxing, the fact there's no distractions, you can't talk to anyone, and on top of that, you're sharing a room with someone, so you're doing it in front of someone else that you don't know as well. Like,
yeah, it's funny though. It's funny that you say that. Yes, you would think that was horrendous, but there's a part of actually being in a room with somebody who's just been through the same thing as you that's somewhat comforting.
Really?
You know what I mean? Like, I'd prefer to go through a detox in front of a room full of people that I'd never met, but that had been through a detox too, than a room full of people that I knew and loved my whole life, but had never experienced it.
So what happens after that week?
I guess after that is when the rubber really hits the road, and it's time to get real. Look, the rehab that I went to was a 12-step based rehab, and you'll hear me talk a lot about 12-step through this. One of the traditions of 12-step is that it's meant to be attraction, not promotion, and I'll try and honour that to the best of my ability. But yeah, NA has been a very big part. NA, Narcotics Anonymous, Alcoholics Anonymous has been a very important and pivotal part of my journey and my recovery. And there's been a few elements that I've had that have really all coupled together. I think not just one would have done it on their own. I've needed them all to retrain my brain and learn the defects and actually what the problem was to start with. So, but I guess once the detox is done, rehab is a lot of group therapy. It's a lot of talking. It's a lot of sitting in a room with a bunch of other people that are going to look you in the eye and call you out on your shit. And they get off on it too. So they get right in. Like, they love looking at somebody else's problems instead of their own. So they're like, you'll say something and then there'll be a room of people that'll just pick it apart. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And call you out on your bullshit. And I think as addicts, or as people, even when we're trying to avoid something, like, we can tell ourselves, I can bullshit myself better than anybody. You know what I mean? Like, I can tell myself a story and believe it to my core. And yeah, so there's a lot of that. There's a lot of quiet time. There's a lot of reflecting. There's a lot of educational groups, like more on a scientific level or on an academic level that, might explain things on that level. There's people from the outside that have lived a life of addiction and got their own recovery that come in and share their experiences. But I think the first thing and one of the hardest things that I found difficult was there was structure and there was routine and really basic, like 101 life stuff that you don't even think about. Like, you got to get up at 6 o'clock and make your bed. It sounds really basic, but when you've been living this fast and loose and wild life for that long, like, basic structure is super foreign.
Yeah. Did you find yourself almost craving that structure though? Like once you were doing it, like waking up at 6, breakfast at 7:30, you were like enjoying that?
No. So I still don't structure that much, but no, yeah, it was. It's just a whole new world from there. And you've got therapists. You do one-on-one therapies.
And they're checking your physically, like your physical body as well.
After that first week, there's and it's obvious that you've sort of made it through that physical body detox. Then that's you get your medicines if you're on medications for whatever, like antidepressants or heart blood pressure medication or whatever it is you might be on. You're not allowed to be in charge of that yourself. That gets dispensed to you at a window by the doctors and the nurses. It's a different world in there.
Was there any part in that 6 weeks that you got to be like, hey, this is going to work this time, or like I actually feel better than I have any other time in rehab, or you know what I mean? Like, was there a pivotal moment in those 6 weeks where you thought this is really going to stick?
The first time that I knew I was different.
Yeah.
So there was an option to be in, so you can stay 4 weeks, which is what most people do, or you can add on an extra 2 weeks. And I did 6 weeks, which was strange enough for me to start with, because normally I'm like, do my time, do my bare minimum, fuck off, get out of there and run my own race and run my own show and think I know better and I know what I'm doing. That had been my previous experience in my other rehab. In my other rehab stays. But the night before it was time for me to leave, I was terrified. And I pulled a nurse aside and I cried. I was like, what if this doesn't work this time? And that had never happened to me before. I'd never been scared to leave. But what I do know is that it was the choices that I made from there that got me to where I am today. And it was the surrender that was required, and it was taking responsibility and ownership of where I was and being able to go, I'm no good here. I need help. I actually don't know. And being able to say, I don't know.
So you're in there for addiction. I don't even want to say meth because at this point it's addiction in general, right? Yeah. Tell me about the people that you met in there and other people who had checked themselves in.
Yeah. And look, it's interesting. And I guess, again, back to that stereotypical thing, you imagine in rehab there's just all of these bad, junkie, methy, heroin, whatever users, and they're just the baddest of the bad, and they're living on streets and whatever. But especially the first time I went to rehab, I actually went to, I was about 24 on my first trip to rehab, and I went to a place called South Pacific Private in Sydney. And that's more of it's a psychiatric hospital, and it does deal with drug and alcohol, but it also deals with like this broad, like you could meet anyone in there. And it shocked me. Like, it wasn't just bad junkies who came from the streets. It was like doctors and nurses and, bank managers and stay-at-home mums and grandmas and all of these people that came from every different walk of life that were struggling with some kind of addiction or mental health, coupled with other mental health issues, which most addicts struggle with anyway, like your codependencies or your trauma bonding or all these different walks of life. But this rehab that I was in at the very end, that got me clean and kept me clean, it was the same thing. Yes, we were all there to get help with our addictions, and they did range from different, I think I've spoken to you about this before as well, just because most people think an alcoholic is an alcoholic because they drink for breakfast, but that's not true. Like, you hear people's different versions of stories. Like, there's lots of high-end businessmen and people in power jobs, and women for that matter, that get up and go to work and pull themselves together and do a really important, high-powered, high-position job, and then get home and destroy themselves, you know what I mean, and drink 2-3 bottles of red wine or drink beer till they pass out. And that's the same thing. It doesn't look the same as what my story did, but however, the basis of it, the stuff that's going on the inside is the same. They're running and they're not being able to get home when all the quiet of work has gone down and the hustle and bustle of the day, they're left sitting with themselves and they can't. So yeah, you meet people from all different walks of life, and I found that super interesting.
Yeah. 'Cause I think that's a big part of this podcast, you know. I hate to say it, but I think I had an idea of what a meth addict was in my head before meeting you.
Yeah.
And, you know, and I was ignorant, because I think in my head it was the person in King's Cross on the road picking at their skin, and you should walk on the other side of the road and you should avoid them at all costs because they're dangerous and they're scary. And meeting you, and, you know, I've got a few other close people close in my life that have gone through rehab now. I just feel so dumb for thinking that, because it's like,
God, don't feel dumb.
But you know what I mean? Like, it actually isn't that. And it's, there's so much more to people's stories. And sometimes it does look like that in King's Cross, but like that person wasn't born like that. You know, there's so much to their story as well. And I think that's, even talking about now rehab, the people, like you mentioned, doctors and nurses, and
the amount of doctors
high functioning people
rehab with, high functioning people that just end up, you know, self-regulating with medication. And I think I actually watched recently, I don't know if you've had a chance to watch it, but there's it's a mini series. It's called Painkillers, and there's also another one on the same story about Dope Sick, and it's about the oxycodone and oxycontin epidemic in America. In America, and it's so true. There are so many people in that story, and even though there's parts of it that are fictionalized, the truth of it is there's so many people that were just beautiful, normal human beings that get hooked on a drug, and it destroys their lives. And I guess that is part of why I wanted to talk about this. And as I said earlier, addiction and that escapism gets anybody. You know what I mean? And you just don't know how somebody ended up where they ended up. And, you know, there's always so much more to it. As we see in the world and in life, everybody's running from something. You know what I mean? Nobody wakes up in the morning and goes, fuck yeah, let's go sit in some pain, man. Yeah. No one's waking up doing that. We all avoid, and even now, and I'm not a Buddhist monk. I'm not sitting up on a hill praying and meditating all day. Of course I run from stuff. I spend way too much time on TikTok. You know what I mean? I go in that rabbit hole and I'm not out for hours. But everybody's doing it to a degree. And as I've said to people before, in no way am I grateful to be an addict. I'm not going to say that ever. You'll hear some people say that, not me. I'm not grateful to be an addict because that caused a lot of people a lot of pain. And do I wish I didn't have that part of me? Yeah, I do. However, I am grateful on a level that my story and where my choices and my disease took me, it took me to a point where I had no choice but to go in and look at myself. There was no other option for me. But so many people in the world walk around avoiding and have this pain and this trauma or whatever it is that they don't know how to manage or regulate or deal with, but their life on paper still looks okay enough to not have to look. Yeah. And I think it's sad that most people, or I won't say most people, but a lot of people could have a much freer life and they don't even know it.
Especially you've got to think about our country, and I love our country, but a lot of our celebrations are around alcohol. So you think someone who's an alcoholic, it'd almost be easier to hide and get away with for a certain degree, because it's very normal to have a few beers at the pub, after a knockoff, or have a few bottles of wine at a night out, or whatever that looks like. And I just imagine that if you pulled out a heavier substance at a party, people are like, oh wow, she has a problem.
Absolutely.
But the person who's having a few bottles could kind of get away with it for a certain amount of time.
Well, it's socially acceptable until you're having it for breakfast, right? Yeah. You know what I mean? But even on a weekend, it's not unusual for somebody to crack a beer or, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon to watch a football game. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And some people can have their 1 or 2 beers and be done with it. But, some people push those boundaries way too far. But yes, because it's alcohol, I don't think in any setting would it ever be okay to pull out a pipe and have 2 puffs and that be okay. But it's okay for people to drink because it's socially acceptable. And that's why I think alcohol is a whole it's another level of dangerous.
Yeah, and we will unpack that. We're going to talk about all different kind of addictions in future episodes. But this was the rehab episode.
Yeah.
This was your experience with rehab, and next episode we'll go into kind of what comes next.
Well, I think like that's my look, and rehab, I could talk about it for days, and there's so much to unpack, and there's so many layers of it. That first bit of rehab where it's intense and you're using and you're detoxing, like it's that circuit breaker, you know what I mean? And it took me a lot of goes to understand it, but it didn't take me 4 weeks to get to where I was. You know, I was 32 years deep, and it wasn't going to take me 4 weeks to get out. And I think people go into rehab thinking this 4 weeks is going to be the solution, and families all get hopeful and they're like, yay, they've gone to rehab, this is solved, and then don't understand why when they come out and go back to their lives and behaving the way they behaved without further treatment or further exploring into the inner world and why we do the things that we do and why we behave the way we behave. And that was what kept me stopped. You know what I mean? And I think that's the next bit of this story is that I did that lockdown stuff. I regulated a little bit. I landed on the ground. I stopped using drugs, but now I had the responsibility to go and deal with all of that trauma and all of that mess.
It's almost like this is where the work begins.
Yeah, and it is. And the work never ends. And I don't think, self-growth and healing, I don't think it ever really ends. But yeah, the next part was where it got real, and where that hard work, and I think that's the bit that a lot of people don't do because it's hard. Yeah.